really wish I sat in this desk.
Yeah, I wish I said it.
This is the section of notes called England and Dutch. We were there today when we were looking at the Netherlands. So, here we go. Okay. There is a little bit of a overview of constitutionalism. If you remember me talking about John Locke in the second treatise and the idea that the government is subject to laws. The government does not have a free will like they do in absolute monarchies. That's kind of what's going to take place. But we get 85 years worth of history before we get there. Nice glasses. All right. So the constitutional government, like I said, that's what's ultimately going to be created. In their case, it's a constitutional monarchy. It doesn't necessarily mean that you get a democracy right away. They still have a constitutional monarchy. So by the end of this story, they have a revolution. They replace it with a constitutional monarchy called, with William and Mary. They have a Bill of Rights. It's basically the same government that they have now. Except that they wielded a little more power than they obviously do now, because the Queen does this and doesn't really govern. And I told you that she's going to live to be 116 years old today. It's a prediction.
Today.
When it comes true.
You know what? You got recorded as proof too.
Anyway, let's look at England in the 17th century. These are the issues. Okay, number one, ambiguously Catholic legacy. Do you guys remember what that is? It still has not been resolved yet. Okay, we have a Catholic without the Pope Church, the Anglican Church. And Elizabeth modified it a little bit, but for the most part, it still has a lot of Catholic or Popish attributes. And that's not going to be satisfactory to a growing number of English people who identify themselves as Puritan. Puritan is literally just English Calvinist. But the Puritan part is that they're trying to purify the English church from its Popish elements, whatever that might be. So where we saw Elizabeth constantly dealing with an onslaught of threats that were coming from the Catholics, when we get to the Stuarts, it's the Puritans that seem to be raising the most cane, noise, whatever you want to call it. The second thing is that you've got King v. Parliament issues that have been going on for a while. I mean, you can go back to like the 12 teens. Everybody's heard of the Magna Carta. You knew that the Parliament was created in the 1240s. So there is this body, this representative body, and it's made up predominantly of landowning aristocrats. But there was supposed to be this idea that this body existed and that there was kind of an ebb and flow of sometimes the Parliament has power, sometimes they have very little power. When you saw the 100 Years' War and the fact that the king had become so dependent on the Parliament to dispense money so that they could continue to fight the 100 Years' War, the Parliament grows in power, the king's power is reduced. And it got so bad that it blew up into a civil war, all right, called the War of the Roses. After the War of the Roses, the Tudor monarchy begins to consolidate power and become more absolutist. Not quite absolutist, they still have the Parliament, but it bears more of those attributes than it might otherwise have. And Henry VIII is certainly kind of like the height of the power centered around the king. I mean, he had the church centered around the king. So that was pretty cool too. The last issue is the Stuarts. And we're going to talk a little bit about them. Remember that Mary, Queen of Scots, has a son who ultimately becomes the King of Scotland. He is known as James VI in Scotland. And after Elizabeth dies, and remember Elizabeth took one for the team, no marriage, no children, hence no heir, then the crown is going to pass on to the closest relative, and that living relative was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII Tudor, known as James Stuart. Okay? The sixth James of Scotland becomes the first James of England, and now you've got Scotland and England united under one person. Now, what religion is Scotland? Oh, I don't know. I guess.
Catholic.
No. They're Calvinists. They were called Presbyterian. John Knox, you guys remember the name John Knox, the Thundering Scot, and all the fighting that went on, and the fact that Elizabeth had even supported the cause of the Protestants against Mary of Guise. There was even a question of whether Walsingham had her poisoned so that the Scottish nobles could gain control and then carve out a Church of Scotland, which was far more Protestant than the Church of England, but they had a book. England had the Book of Common Prayer. They had the Book of Common Order. And John Knox is kind of like their Martin Luther, if you will. All right? And he didn't like Mary of Guise. He didn't really like women that ruled. Okay? I think he wrote a book called First Trumpet Blast Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. That was the name of it. Elizabeth was not happy with him. So he was in Geneva when he wrote it, but he came back. Anyway, so Scotland is a Protestant place. Mary, Queen of Scots, we didn't get to see what she could have done had she been like a stable queen in Scotland, because she got involved in all these adulterous affairs, murder raps, and a whole bunch of stuff. And she was chased out. She was in exile. She was conspiring with people to kill Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth killed her instead. All right? So now James is coming from a predominantly Protestant state to become the King of England. And whereas Queen Elizabeth was kind of, into the pageantry associated with being a monarch, James was not. And the biggest problem that James had is he just did not want to take orders from anybody. Okay? He was the original absolutist. He's the original divine right absolutist. Even though I gave you a name, Bishop Jacques Bossuet, Politics Drawn from Holy Scripture, that wasn't written until 1678. Okay, or published in 1678 or 79. In 1598, there was a work from James called True Law of Free Monarchies, which is essentially saying the same thing. That God appoints kings. Kings are answerable to God. Kings aren't answerable to the people. So he's going to right away be kind of out of sorts when he has to deal with English people and their parliament and their constant, proposals of this, that, and the other thing. All right? Elizabeth was at least recognizing the fact that there was a parliament. It made them feel important. Okay? She was smart enough to at least navigate around some of those traditional roles. James was not, he didn't have that kind of couth. So when he shows up in England the first time, and there's like a parade, and he's got to wave to people, and there's a procession coming through, and trumpeters and all that stuff, he looks and he kind of mumbles under his breath, "Yeah, they can kiss my royal arse." He's like, "This all sucks, And he was doing that. Because he's like, I hate the pomp, and I hate the circumstance, and I hate the fact that I have to even, mix with these subjects. So that's not good. But the Puritans are jacked up about the fact that they've got a king in England now that comes from a Protestant country, because their dream is to purify the English church, and now they think they got one of them. And that was the early fun, was because they went and they were like, "Hey, James, we got some ideas for you. And this popish church that we go to, we're really tired of it. So they put together this list of grievances, and they send it to the king and say, "We would like to meet with you, sir, and discuss these things about all this crap that, is popish, that we hate about our church, and we want to purify it. And we know that, as a fellow Protestant brother, that we'll be able to hammer some stuff out." So they have this thing called the Molinari Petition, and they all meet. And James is kind of like, and they're like, "Hearty," doing that kind of hearty stuff, right? And all their problems that they have with the Anglican faith. And he gets done listening to it, and he's like, "All right, I shall rule. We're not making any changes. I kind of dig the Anglican Church." And the only reason he did is because he knew that would piss them off. Because he was basically saying, if I didn't hate the fact that my subjects are telling me what should be what, right, I might be okay with having a more Protestant church. But I'm going to arrive at that decision on my own with the help of God. I'm not going to have it with a bunch of people that are going to give me a list of grievances. So not only did he reject them, but then he went out and published a book called The Book of Sports. And the reason why he did this is because Calvinists freaking hated participation of entertaining things on Sundays. It was sort of like, that's God's day. You know, there's no drinking, there's no wearing bright colors, there's no dancing, and there sure as hell is not going to be athletic contests. So James writes a book talking about how great athletic contests on Sundays are. Okay? It's almost just like, you know, like that to all of the English subjects. Saying, guess who's the king? Me, not you. And I think we should play sports. And they were pretty upset. So I'll just read you a little excerpt from it so that you can get an idea of the kind of things that England was into on Sundays. It says, as for our good people's lawful recreation, our pleasure likewise is, that at the end of divine service our good people be not disturbed or discouraged from any lawful recreation, such as dancing, either men or women, archery for men, dancing, leaping, vaulting, or any other such harmless recreation, or from the having of hay games, whatever the hell a hay game is, whitsunnails, morris dances, or setting up maypoles, or other sports therewithin used. But with all we do here account still is prohibited all unlawful games, like, you know, tying a bear to a fence and then, I don't know, stabbing it so that everybody can cheer. They did that. Either that or they would tie the bear and then they would stick attack dogs on it, and I guess you could bet on which dog finally got the fatal blow. So those are what we call blood sports, and they had them, but they were certainly working to try to outlaw those. But as far as a good old-fashioned whitsunnail goes, I mean, have at it, whatever the hell that is, as I said. So that's his insult, and it was literally just him being James and saying, people don't tell me what I'm supposed to do. So this is the point in our story where the English Puritans got on their little boats and then sailed across the Atlantic and said, oh, you guys are mean. There's religious intolerance. We want to go and set up our own community. So they went, and then they had like Thanksgiving dinner with the Indians, as you know, and everybody brought things and they all sat down together and enjoyed each other's company. So Plymouth, and all of those other things that you hear about, Massachusetts Bay Colony, that's all stuff that was happening where there was a bunch of people that were so disgusted by James and his policies that they left for North America. So you got that. Okay, what else? James developed sources of income to keep Parliament out of control. This is like the absolute monarchy textbook 101 thing to do. It's like, I don't want to have to rely on them for money, and I won't have to call Parliament if I don't need them. So if I can come up with alternate sources of income where I can build the royal treasury without having to ask them to dispense of monies, then I'm in business. So these things that you read about, impositions, tonnage, poundage, all of this stuff, which is related to like shipping and commerce and that sort of stuff, he starts throwing down a whole bunch of things to try to raise revenues. And they're pissed about that because they believe that as a judicial body, they're supposed to have approval over whether this tax is lawful or that tax is lawful. And he just said, I'm doing it. Okay? Other stuff and mentions. James brings on trouble himself, that his court was full of scandal and corruption. His head guy in charge is this guy named the Duke of Buckingham. And apparently he and James had a love affair that was kind of like bending everybody out of shape. Not the fact that Buckingham was kind of like, most people like hated Buckingham so much that they assumed that James was a stand-up guy, but was just unduly influenced by Buckingham. And that if you were able to get rid of Buckingham, that everything would have been fine. So there were some, some grumblings that they were gonna, to Buckingham, but it never happened. The other thing they did was they sold off titles. That's a good way to make money. They started to relax controls on Catholics, as if he hasn't antagonized the Puritans enough. Let's make nice with the Catholics. Signed a peace treaty with Spain, and remember they had been at war with Spain kind of on and off since the whole 1588 thing. I mean, remember that Philip tried to kill the Queen. So him going and saying, we're friends with Spain now, that kind of insulted them. They were so upset that they published this work called The Great Protestation, which is, we're really mad, okay? They were upset about the duties, and they were upset about a variety of other things. James somehow was able to navigate through his reign without being killed. That's a good thing, because there was a lot of people that probably were upset with him, but he wasn't like that in your face with the things that he was doing, I guess. It seems like he was. But he survives. His reign ends in 1625, and then Charles I is the next in line, and he was even more, anti-parliament. They come in, and a whole bunch of friends of the parliament assassinated Duke of Buckingham, like I told you. It seems like that would be a good thing to do, because Buckingham is the reason why it seemed like James was a bad guy when James was a real good guy. So if we can get rid of Buckingham, we feel like we could probably control this Charles I. So they had him assassinated, and Charles was not happy about it, and replaced Buckingham with somebody they hated more. His name was Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, known as Black Tom. Okay? It says Charles did more to upset the Puritan-dominated parliament than James I ever did. The first one was tax policy again. Now he came up with a new source of revenue that they called ship money. Now, ship money in its original intent was this, almost like if you were a coastal area, that you would have to pay some kind of like fee to have the English Navy protect the coast. It'd be like, hiring out the Coast Guard or something like that. Okay? So if you lived in Providence or some like coastal area, you'd have to pay for the Coast Guard to be there to guard the coast. Right? So there was this thing called ship money, and at least it was in bounds. But he said, you know what? It doesn't seem right that just the coast is protected. Inland is protected by our Navy and our ships as well. So we're going to make everybody pay for it. And then they lost their minds, because the Parliament doesn't want to have to pay taxes without their consent. I don't know if you've ever heard this argument, this no taxation without representation argument. It seems to circle around. Okay, and that's kind of what's happening. A tyrannical king is imposing taxes without the consent of the sovereign body, supposedly the Parliament, who determines whether those taxes are lawful or not. So then there's a legal fight. Okay? There's a court battle, and unfortunately at the end of the court battle, Charles was able to keep his ship money. All right? But they're clearly upset. And they know that this turned out really bad. We assume that if James left, and all of his arrogance and antagonism, that we'd be able to deal with Charles. It turns out Charles is worse. Okay? Then, if you recall, Spain is now starting to go towards the Netherlands, which is the one time where England's a little freaked out about what Spain could potentially do. So now they're saying, well, we need to raise some revenue because there's a possibility that we might go to war with Spain. All right, and so they needed to be able to raise some revenue, and Charles is thinking, well, I gotta call them. Now think about the Parliament. They've been sidelined for 25 years. They've been shunned. They've been ignored. They've been made fun of. They've been ridiculed, and they've been circumvented. So when they show up, they're going to be like, all right, buddy, we'll give you your money, but there's a bunch of stuff that needs to get done, and you need to listen. Okay, it said, if the petition of right, this is what they call their document. It's basically like their list of grievances, but it's almost written almost like a law that said, you need to follow this law. Otherwise, you can forget about any money coming from us. And it's peculiar because if you look at some of it is in the Bill of Rights. The original constitutional document that England has after the Revolution. It said, king would be subject to the law. King could not impose taxes without Parliament's consent. King cannot impose forced loans. King could not impose martial law in peacetime. King cannot quarter troops in private homes. So he's like, and then another thing, and we don't like Black Tom, and all this other stuff. Right? And he's like, yeah, whatever. I need the money. Shut up. Give it to me. I'll sign it. And then he signs it. And then he dismisses Parliament for 11 years. They don't meet. So you can imagine them like just screaming. And then he's like, thanks. I got my money. See ya. And then shuts the door on them. And they're like knocking like, Charles, this is not funny, man. Come on. And so that goes on for 11 years. He goes and does his own thing. They're completely shut out and they're upset, obviously. Here's how it gets better. So he circumvents, Parliament, sells titles to his friends, spends a bunch of money, surrounds himself with advisors that the people absolutely hate. We know about Wentworth. The new advisor is a religious advisor, and his name is William Laud. And remember how the Puritans were upset about the fact that they couldn't worship the way that they wanted to worship. They had to worship in the Anglican faith because that was the official faith of England. Archbishop William Laud is kind of like the dedicated Anglican that says, we are going to make sure that publicly that everybody is adhering to all the rules of our service and that nobody's cheating it. So his religious policy is literally that. The one thing that he tells you, though, is that he's only using that standard for Puritans. The Catholics continue to get freedom of worship rights, which means that if you're the Puritans, you're not only being denied a Puritan church, but it seems like the church is slowly but surely evolving back towards Catholicism. And there was always that back in the mind fear that that's what was coming next. Does everybody follow so far? Okay. His wife, it mentions Charles's wife. Her name is Henrietta Maria. Right? If your name is Maria, you're Catholic. Okay? There's just no way around that. All right? Turns out she was the sister of French King Louis XIII, so she's very Catholic. All right? The laws against the Catholics were not enforced, but the laws against Puritans were clearly enforced. But remember, one of the things that happened when the Stuarts took over as kings of England, they were also the kings of Scotland. And this is a weird kind of thing, because at least James had the high-mindedness, if you will, to leave Scotland alone. So when he's like upsetting all the English Puritans, he's not upsetting the Scottish Presbyterians. All right? Charles didn't do that. And William Laud did not do that either. And William Laud said, this Church of Scotland crap, no, they're Anglican. And so they literally imposed a law on Scotland that said, you will worship in the way that the Church of England worships, or we will press charges against you. And the Scots, I don't know if you know this about the Scots, were fiercely independent. And they were very pissed off by this. Okay. It's a kind of a tragic comedy, if you will. All right. I mean, there's stories about like priests trying to like worship, like use the Book of Common Prayer, which is the English book, in Scotland, and having to hold guns out on the audience because they were so upset about it. I know that doesn't make any sense, but that's what was going on. The Scots were that upset because it's England imposing its will on them. And remember, Scotland's backstory is that they had fought for independence. When England was imposing its will on Scotland back in the late 1200s and early 1300s, they went to war against England and won a battle in 1314 and got their independence. This is just crap luck that it turns out that their ruling dynasty is now England's ruling dynasty. And now they've got William Laud imposing high Anglicanism on a Presbyterian faith, which is very close to Calvinism. So what do the Scots do? Do they rebel? Yes, of course they rebel. But they do it Scottish style, by invading England. Does everybody understand that that's kind of extreme? Yeah, they're so pissed off they invade England. And now Charles, now look at this situation. He's just created a really difficult situation because now he's got to go to Parliament. Remember Parliament that he left on the sidelines for 11 years? Now he has to call Parliament so that Parliament can appropriate the funds for him to deal with the Scottish rebellion. How do you think Parliament's going to respond to that situation? They're going to come in here like somebody that's been ignored for 11 years. And they bring their buddies and they show up. And they're like, wait a second. All right, first of all, we want you to sign the Petition of Right. And Thomas Wentworth, we want Wentworth dead. And Archbishop Laud, we want him dead. And you're not going to impose martial law. And you're going to follow this. And you're going to follow that. And Charles is like, and shuts the door on them again. That's why they're called the Short Parliament. They last from April of 1640 to April of 1640. They're out. Now Parliament's really ticked. But nothing's changed. He hasn't solved the problem. He still has a Scottish rebellion. Okay? How the hell is he going to deal with it? This one's interesting. It's called the Treaty of Ripon. R-I-P-O-N. You have to look it up. It's interesting. Long story short, Charles signs a treaty with the Scots to pay them like £850 a day to not invade England. That's how he settled it. It's like, I'm going to pay you money to not invade us. That's the treaty. Okay? Where's he going to get the money? The people that can give him the money have been shut out again after an 11-year shutout, and then they got immediately shut out again. Okay? So the Scots figure, hey, we figured out that it's clearly a lie, it's a ruse. They're not going to meet the terms of the treaty, so they proceed with their invasion. And then the Irish find out about it. So the Irish are watching CNN and they see the Scots in rebellion. The Irish are like, well, they're not going to beat us to that, and then they, put down their pints, and then they run out in the road and they start revolting. So now there's an open-ended rebellion in Ireland, an open-ended rebellion in Scotland, an angry parliament, and Charles is like, okay, all right, come on in. The parliament's like, you need us, don't you? Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, well, things is going to be different this time. And Charles is like, yeah, I know, pinky swear, I close the doors on you guys again. So this one's called the Long Parliament. And they didn't leave for 20 years. Okay. They condemned Strafford and Laud to charges of treason and executed both of them. They abolished the court of the Star Chamber, which is the Star Chamber was like an instrument of torture for nobles, basically, that was invented by Henry VII Tudor. And they recognized it almost as like a tool for kingly oppression. So they got rid of the court, they disbanded it. They got rid of the Court of the High Commission because they saw the Court of the High Commission as a religious body that was persecuting Puritans. So they got rid of that too. They declared the levying taxes without Parliament's consent to be illegal. And then, just for added measure, they wrote another list of grievances called the Grand Remonstrance, which meant, we're really pissed at you, dude. Then, this is kind of what happens. Parliament's made all of these sweeping changes, then they don't know what to do. They're kind of sitting around like, so what? Do we need to have some rules? Or, we've never been here before. How do we meet? What do we decide? Should we write something? Well, we could write another remonstrance, I guess. So they're sitting around kind of like looking at each other saying, all right, so we clearly have more power than we've had in a while. What are we supposed to do with it? And then Charles is like, they're like, Charles? Yeah, can I go to the bathroom? And they're like, yeah, if you gotta go, you gotta go. Charles is like, I need to go to the bathroom in New York. And they're like, why do you have to go to New York? Well, that's where my favorite bathroom is. So I need to go up to York and go to the bathroom. And then I promise I'll come back and I'll sit here with you guys and you can do your Parliament stuff again. So they're like, all right, go. Charles, do your thing. Charles is like, thanks. See you soon. All right. So he goes to York. And when he gets there, he raises an army to march on Parliament. So they find out about it. While he was in the bathroom, yes, he goes to Yorkshire. He returns with a royalist-supported army to invade Parliament. And then the Parliament's sitting around and they're kind of like, not this time. He's not going to disband us again, so we're going to fight him. And that's where they raise their own army and that's when the Civil War starts. So you've got Charles and the Royalists versus the Protestant, Puritan, parliamentary crew. Like I wrote in the notes, not this time, Sonny Boy. House of Commons passes, it's called the Militia Ordinance to raise an army against Charles, then the Civil War is on.
Is that one Civil War is like the Cavaliers and the Flatheads or something?
Yeah, it's called the Roundheads, but yeah, this is on. Okay?
That was on last
The
week.
two reasons why the Civil War is fought. The first is, does the king have power or did Parliament share power with the king? That's one of the things to be decided. The Parliament is clearly fighting for option B, Parliament shares power with the king. The second is, what should the English religion look like? Because you're still contesting the ambiguously Catholic legacy. The Puritans dominate the Parliament, so their hope is, if we pull out a V here, if we get a win, then the chances are we can rewrite V for victory. If we can get a win, then maybe we get to rewrite the English book, and our religious services start conforming to our Calvinist dreams. So, Charles's forces are called the Royalists or the Cavaliers. Their leader is this dude named Prince Rupert. Parliament's forces are called the Roundheads, and the reason why was because they had Beatles 64 haircuts, basically, where they put a bowl around them and then literally just cut. So they had these round cropped hair. That's why they were called Roundheads. Their leader is Thomas Fairfax, and then later Oliver Cromwell, and Cromwell is the one that really kind of emerges as the great military commander. Okay, he even creates his own group, kind of like a parliamentary army within a parliamentary army called the New Model Army, and then had a naval sidekick called the Ironsides. And the Parliament, because they were predominantly settled in southeastern England, they had control over the Navy. They had most of the control over the finances. That if you looked at where Charles's friends were, they were mostly landowning aristocrats that were up in the northern and western portions of England. So it really was kind of like a regional fight. All right, London and surrounding territories versus the Yorks and the Upper Peninsula there, or whatever it's called, the Midlands, I think it is. All right, I'll show you a place where you can read about these, but here's a handful of key battles that you may see here and there. The ones that seem to come up a lot are Marston Moor and Naseby. These are big parliamentary wins. Early on, there was some I guess, what do you want to call them, stalemates. But clearly the Parliament is getting the upper hand. And by the 1646, 47, 48, it's clear that Parliament's going to win. Not to mention the fact that, remember, there's still a rebellion in Scotland. Okay, and the Scots were actually supporting the Parliament at first because the Scots saw the Parliament as being Puritan or Calvinist brothers. And so they were doing some of the heavy lifting in order to fight Charles's armies that were situated in the north that were close to Scotland. So it's almost like Charles had to fight a two-front war in order to win. And eventually he gets captured by the Scots and turned over. And then Parliament's going to have a trial for him. And Scotland kind of they wanted to take back on that. Because this is their ancient freaking dynasty here. The Stuarts? That's what's going to happen? They have hundreds of years of Stuart, genealogy, and now all of a sudden they just turned over their dynasty and said something's going to happen to this guy, and they were right, because Parliament voted to have his head cut off. Accused him of treason, decapitated the lad. All right? If you've ever seen paintings of Charles I, he kind of looks like John Lennon. And John Lennon was assassinated in 1980, and Charles was assassinated in 1649. Coincidence?
Wait.
I was just messing with you. That was fun. No. None of the things that I just said in the last 20 seconds are connected in any way. All right. So there's a very weird period of history in England. It's called interregnum. And it means that the only time in English history that there has not been a monarch. Okay, 1649 to 1658 is a phase of English history where Parliament's now in charge. You have eliminated the king. Okay, his successor, his heir, I guess, was hiding in a tree trunk and ended up in France somewhere. All right. So the rest of the future of the Stuart dynasty is like getting, smuggled out in a tree or something like that. Anyway, there's two phases of this period. The first is called the Commonwealth phase, and the second is called the Cromwellian Protectorate. So there is a 5-year period where it's like pure discourse in the Parliament to decide what the future of England's going to be. Right? The second one was where Oliver Cromwell's kind of like tapping his foot. And this is what happens. You've gotten rid of one form of government, and now there is clear divisions on what they're supposed to do next. And usually when that happens, some powerful person is going to step up and say, all right, enough talking, we need to do. And Cromwell decides that he will be the doer. And for all practical purposes, under Cromwell, there's a military dictatorship. So England is under a dictator for about 5 years. But before it got to that, it was literally like just a stream of petitions to decide, what's going to happen next. So the first thing that happened was that if there were any Anglicans left in the government, they were chased out with the help of the army. All right, there's a colonel, his name is Thomas Pride, and basically by bayonet point, any of the high Anglicans that might be hanging around the Parliament ran for the doors. So what was left over, they call it the rump Parliament. But it was entirely Puritan. Okay? So, the endless discussion part, and there's a whole bunch of things that happen, but there's a couple of groups that come out. And the reason why they should be mentioned is because the ideas that they're proposing for government were way, way, way ahead of their time. Right? The first is John Lilburne and this group called the Levelers. And his petition was based on a work of his called The Agreement of the People. And if you read it, literally what Lilburne was asking for was a modern democracy. Full participatory democracy for everybody. Universal suffrage, not for women, but for men. All right. And that was the plan. It was a type of government that you would not see in England until like the 1880s. But it was being proposed in the 1640s. So peasants, workers, everybody, that there would be almost like a full participatory democracy, and that was their proposal. And then the Puritans, who were dominated by wealthy landowners or merchants, looked at that group because they were members of the non-property classes and said, no, we're not doing this. And the Levelers got leveled. Best way to kind of describe the outcome. Another group that popped up was even maybe more advanced than the Levelers. The Levelers wanted a universal suffrage. We call this modern liberalism when we get into the 19th century. The Diggers wanted the equal distribution of wealth. They were like frickin' Bernie Sanders for the 1640s. All right? They saw property as being an evil that needed to be eradicated and then shared among the common. Okay? Needless to say, the Diggers did not succeed either. Then you had a parade of a whole bunch of different religious groups that were looking for freedom of religion. The Puritans weren't going to listen to them, but they were popping up. There were Quakers, there were Shakers, there were this group called the Fifth Monarchy Men. All right, you can Google some of these, but it was nonstop. This religious group, this political group, this social activist group, and they're each making a petition to say, this is the government that England should have next. And that's the point where nothing's going on. The Parliament hasn't really made any movement. So Oliver Cromwell, who was the head of the army, basically, comes in and said, everybody out. I've had enough of this. Okay, here's my agreement of the people. I am going to be Lord Protector of England. You guys are all going to yield your power to me. He wrote this thing called the Instrument of Government, which is basically like if Thomas Hobbes had a social contract, it would look like the one that was drawn up for Cromwell. Okay? In other words, anarchy needs to be replaced by some kind of sovereign, and that sovereign was in the form of Oliver Cromwell. Okay? The other stuff that happens, and this one's pretty interesting, but now Cromwell is running the country. There's some good things that he does. One of them is that he begins the process of building England into the colonial power that they become. Starts building their navy. Part of it starts with aiming its commercial policies at the Dutch. And they do this in the form of what's called the First Navigation Act. Okay? It'll be coupled later, but Cromwell begins this process of starting commercial battles with the Dutch. And they wanted to be able to subvert the monopoly that the Dutch had on shipping and shipping rates really throughout the world. So at least for English goods, they said all English goods have to be on English boats and subject to English duties. And that would effectively cut out at least the English part of the trade monopoly from the Dutch. The second thing is that once Scotland realized that Scotland had basically handed over the Stuart monarchy, they turned and ended up fighting against Parliament. Oliver Cromwell solved that problem by taking his army and beating the smack out of Scotland, okay, and pacifying them. The other thing that Oliver Cromwell did was that there was still an uprising in Ireland, if you guys recall. Cromwell dealt with Ireland, okay, and he dealt with them in a really intense way. The way that the Irish are used to being dealt with when the English come to town. That they burned down a couple of their towns, okay? They slaughtered a bunch of the rebels. They rounded them up, you know, and everything else. And then when they got done slaughtering the Irish peasants, the ones that they didn't slaughter, they forced them off of their land and then distributed that land to the people that were loyal to Oliver Cromwell, who then became absentee landowners over land that was formerly held by Irish peasants. So it has a twofold effect. Slaughter the crap out of the Irish and then steal their land. And then force them to become tenant farmers on their own land. Okay? That's pretty much a constant in English-Irish relations. Okay? And it finally hits a head in the 1840s, and we'll talk about that later. Okay? All right, the other part about it was that Cromwell is trying to create a Puritan state. Okay? Now, the English thought they wanted this. And most of them, you know, some of them didn't, but the dedicated Puritans were really excited. We're gonna have like a whole freaking country that's Geneva. It'll be so sweet. You know, Puritan style government. Except that Puritans aren't fun. If anybody's ever seen Puritans, they look like American Gothic. All right? A whole bunch of people with really stern faces with pitchforks. No swearing, no dancing, no fun of any kind. Freaking Dean Wormer for Animal House. Okay? There is no fun. They closed the taverns. For Christ's sakes, could you imagine that in England? No booze? Okay? So a whole bunch of like hardcore Puritan, we are going to like turn this into the most God-fearing place on the planet, and a bunch of English were like, this sucks. It's like we replaced one tyrant, Charles, with another tyrant, Cromwell. Except Charles was at least let us drink. Cromwell's no fun. Okay? He's the, I don't know, roundhead Dean Wormer. So that's no good. He dies, and after he dies, it was supposed to be like they were going to pass like control of, or the Lord Protector title onto his son, and his son's like, I'm good. I'll be dead. And then they're like, oh crap, what are we going to do now? We need a new government. All right, and by that point, everybody was pining to get the Stuart monarchy back. under the promise that the Stuart monarchs would come back. They hated Puritanism now because they tried it and hated it. So they were kind of down with going back to Anglicanism. And they wanted to have their monarchy back because, we'll take it, and as long as that monarchy is willing to cooperate with the Parliament, we should be good. And for a while, things went really well. They restored the Stuart monarchy in the form of Charles II. So we've got James I, then Charles I, then Decapitado, and then Civil War, then Cromwell, and now Restoration, Charles II. 25-year reign, seemed like it was going really well. And at the beginning, 1660s and 70s, he seems like he's working with them. All right, then he got comfortable. 1660s, he's like, all right, hey, there was a fire in London. It seems like most natural disasters, the people will rally around their leaders. So that happened. Then there was a plague outbreak and another natural disaster. They rally around their leader. He seems like he's helping. There was a lot of rebuilding of London. He was front and center on making sure that got done. Okay? There was this thing where they were going to restore high Anglicanism. There was a parliamentary decree called the Clarendon Code, which meant that nonconformists were going to be at least on a watch list, if you will. And he signed off on that. And so it seems like it's cool. King working with Parliament, Anglican, the Puritan extremists on one end are being watched, the Catholic extremists on the other are being watched. Everything seems like it's going well. Charles passes another navigation act. England is building into this big commercial power, colonial power, naval power. They're fighting the Dutch. They're winning. They're stealing stuff from the Dutch. Good times. New Amsterdam becomes New York. South Africa, that's not South Africa until 1909. It was called Dutch Cape Colony. Becomes British Cape Colony. Okay. Then, in the middle of all of these Dutch wars, there was a secret peace treaty that was signed with Louis XIV and Charles II. And what was weird about it, it wasn't published. Okay, nobody kind of knew about it. But it was Louis remember I told you that Louis had fought a war where England was fighting against him. And then he was kind of like, dude, that doesn't seem right that you're fighting against us. We have different worlds. You have your fights with the Dutch. We have our fights with the Dutch. How about you fight the Dutch and we'll fight the Dutch? We'll take their stuff on the continent. You can take their stuff in the colonies. And that way we don't have to fight each other. And Charles was kind of like, yeah, that sounds good. Us not having to contest you would be good. So that's how it goes down. What the hell's going on? Boy Scouts need to get up in their rooms, man.
Where are the seats?
This is not a place for... The wilderness is a good place for the Boy Scouts. All right? Anyway, it's called the Treaty of Dover. You guys can look it up. The big concern, though, was that Louis was... Not only did he get a concession that there would be some English neutrality if he decided to go against the Netherlands again, but there was also some Catholic talk. Remember, Louis XIV is a Catholic. He's just, he's in the process of angling out some of the religious minorities in France. He's trying to get Charles to hey, you need to chill on those Catholics, man. Maybe convert yourself someday. Your wife's Catholic, you should be Catholic. So there's that going on, all right? And now there's a fear, and it's not an unwarranted fear, that maybe, just maybe, England is going to go back to being an absolute monarchy and potentially to be a Catholic monarchy, all right? And in the 1670s, there was a couple of things that were done. One of them was called the Declaration of Indulgence, which was kind of winking at the Catholics and saying, hey, you guys, you're good again. Don't worry about that Clarendon Code stuff. Nonconformists. We're talking about the Puritans. You guys are good. The Parliament jumped on it. Said, hey, wait a second. We've been down this road before. All right, you're not going to be a Charles the One or James the One on this stuff, are you? Charles is like, you're right, man. I'm sorry. And they force him to sign this thing that's called the Test Act. This is important. It's going to be in effect really until 1829, but it's basically that there are going to be no nonconformists, but really they were talking about Catholics. We're not going to be in charge in universities. They were not going to have civil posts. They were not going to have any political power. It was literally like they're anathema. Okay? But we seem to be moving down a path. All right? His brother is the Duke of York. Right now, he doesn't have an heir. Okay? His heir is non-existent. His brother would become the King of England if anything happened to him. And his brother's sort of like, overtly Catholic. And now they're like a little freaked out about it. He's married to Catherine of Braganza. This is another Catholic. There is this plot that was carried out, and this is really sad, but there was this belief that Catholics were working together to try to blow up the Parliament. Okay? And so they basically took like 7 or 8 Catholics that were completely innocent and sacrificed them. All right, last piece before we get to the other stuff, but it's called Ending the Veil. And now Charles has passed on from this earth and gone to the next. And James, his brother, is going to take charge. And you notice that he's not going to last long, 1685 to 88. He immediately passes a big, bold relaxation on Catholics called the Declaration of the Liberty of Conscience. His wife is a Catholic. She comes from Este. You guys remember that place in Italy? Isabella d'Este. Yeah, Beatrice. Remember that crew? Okay, like Renaissance. I mean, that's Italian, man. That's about as Catholic as it's going to get. So there's this neat little story about how if they have an heir, that is going to be a Catholic, an avowed Catholic heir. And there's a story that she's been having miscarriages. And then apparently one day, she's pregnant again. And it's pretty clear that that baby is going to be stillborn or whatever the case is. But supposedly they had the dead baby. They put it in a bedpan. And then there was a servant or something that also had a baby that day that was healthy. And so they wheeled the dead baby down, and then they took the servant's baby and wheeled that up. And they're like, oh, cool, a baby. And then the Parliament looks at them like, no, time out. No, we want a replay on that. That they knew that there were some shenanigans that were associated with it. But the second part of it was, it was enough is enough. They had already been making plans, what happens if James and his wife and this kid, are literally going to reconfigure England into becoming a Catholic state again, and they weren't going to sit on it. Okay, he was ignoring their decree. So we've hit ahead here. There might be Catholicism, and then we've also got there might be attempts to try to eliminate Parliament. Okay, last bit. And we're going to take a break shortly, but the parliamentary opposition, and this is important, you actually see the beginnings of, political parties for the first time. Parliament is dominated by old landowning aristocrats. These are agricultural aristocrats, estate owners. And they became identified with this group called the Tories. Tories would eventually become the Conservative Party. The Whigs were dominated by merchants. These would be seaborne merchants, financiers, but propertied wealth, but it's more of a middle class style. And they were called the Whigs. And between the two of them, they agreed that James needed to go. And so James I had a daughter, James II had a daughter who was Protestant, who was married to William of Orange. It doesn't get more Protestant than that. Okay? So the Dutch, William of Orange, is married to James II's daughter. That's a typo. Mary Stuart. So it stays in the family, but it's very clearly Protestant. And they're going to basically have a revolution where they depose James II and replace him with William of Orange and Mary. So if you've ever heard of William and Mary, there you go. Okay? Okay, so this is the revolution, and it's called the Glorious Revolution. And the reason why it's the Glorious Revolution is because there really wasn't any bloodshed. It was a very English kind of, very proper. We no longer want James, we want William and Mary, and then it just happened. Okay, there was a little bit of a conflict. The people that supported James II were called Jacobites. One of James' supporters, and this is unfortunate, was the Irish, who were hoping that if James II stayed in power, that James would cut a deal and remember that the Irish helped him, and that there was some of the awful land grabs and everything else that was going on in Ireland, maybe that stuff would stop. Unfortunately, the Irish backed the wrong course. Okay. All right. The Glorious Revolution was neither glorious nor a revolution. What that means basically is that about 6% of the people actually benefited from the revolution. These are very wealthy white landowners. Okay? But it is a revolution in the sense that an absolute monarchy or a wannabe absolute monarchy is now replaced with a legal thing called a constitution that is going to now have legal code that the king has got to follow. It's the Lockean social contract being played out in real time. All right? William and Mary are the first constitutional monarchs of England, and this is the beginning of what they are. Okay? Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, press, assembly, trial by jury, all this stuff should sound familiar to you. No taxation without representation. Now you have a parliament that shares power with the king. Okay? Some other stuff. Toleration Act, where they're going to give the Protestants freedom of worship, but not the Catholics. The Act of Succession is where the last of the Stuarts die. Queen Anne, this poor woman, she had 14 kids, and not one of them made it past age 5. All right, so she's out, and they ended up passing the crown on to make sure that it stayed Protestant. They passed it on to some Germans from this group called the House of Hanover. So the next, when you hear about George, George the First, George the Second, George the Third, they're all from this family called the Hanoverians. Okay. Robert Walpole, anybody ever heard that name? What do you think he is the first of in England? Kind of an important figure in English politics now.
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, that's right. That's his first title. Okay? The Catholics. Then I got to find this source because there's something that I wanted to read out of it. The Catholics are basically going to be excluded, and they're going to stay excluded for a very long time. Okay? Let me add one thing, and it's called the Penal Code, but I wanted to read to you guys what ended up happening to the Irish for supporting James II.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's so cool.
Bear with me, folks. There it is. All right, listen to this. There it is. Okay. This is, if you want to realize, the Irish were treated in the UK virtually like inferior people, I guess. So here's what happened. It says, after the Revolution of 1688, in which the final overthrow of James took place at the Boyne River, it's called Battle of Boyne River, the English feared Ireland as a source of danger to the post-revolutionary arrangements in England. Resistance of the subjugated Catholics had also to be prevented. They didn't want any comebacks from the Catholics. They saw the Irish as being a potential landing area since there was a lot of Irish Catholics. So they needed to make sure that they pacified the Irish and the Catholics, but particularly the Irish Catholics. So here's what they did. And it sounds like something like Nuremberg law kind of stuff. It says, hence to the burden of an alien church and absentee landlordism. I talked about both of those things. Ireland is predominantly Catholic. They imposed Anglican faith on the Irish and then gave all the power to Irish Protestants. But then the other part is every time Ireland was involved in an uprising against England, they not only slaughtered a ton of Irish, but they also stole their land and then forced them to become tenant farmers on that land. I mentioned that before. But here's what it says. Resistance of the subjugated Catholics had also to be prevented, hence to the burden of an alien church and absentee landlordism was now added the penal code. Catholic clergy were to be banished. Catholics were forbidden to vote or sit in the Irish Parliament. Catholic teachers were forbidden to teach. Catholic parents were forbidden to send children overseas to be educated in Catholic schools. No Catholic could take a degree at Trinity College, an Anglican institution. Catholic Irishmen were forbidden to purchase land, to lease it for more than to lease it for more than 31 years, to inherit it from a Protestant, or to own a horse worth £5. So 4-pound horse, you're good. 5-pound horse, can't own it. A Catholic whose son turned Protestant found his property rights limited in his own son's favor. Catholics were forbidden to be attorneys, to serve as constables, or in most trades, to have more than 2 apprentices. Some disabilities fell on the Protestant Irish also. Thus, Irish shipping was excluded from the British colonies, nor could the Irish import colonial goods except through England. Export of Irish woolens and glass manufactures was prohibited. No import tariff on English manufacturers could be levied by the Irish Parliament. About all that was left to the Irish was the export of agricultural produce, and the foreign exchange acquired in this way went very largely to pay the rents of absolute landowners. So, Catholics couldn't do anything, and then they economically deprived them to the point that they were so poor that they couldn't rise up and fight against them. And that stayed in effect, and the impacts of that were by the end of the 19th century, there was like 4 million fewer Irish in Ireland than there was at the beginning of the 19th century. Okay? It's a lot of people in Ireland say this is genocide. It's not like they're running around slaughtering all of the Irish, but they are putting systems in place that more or less equate to the deprivation of a people's ability to exist in any kind of quality. Okay? And they created the conditions that ultimately bred the Irish potato famine, which was pretty damn close to genocide. So that's a pick-me-up, and on that, we'll take a little bit of a break. There's a question that will ask you what the difference is between the kind of absolutism that Louis has versus the kind of absolutism that's going to develop in Central and Eastern Europe. Because there is 2 sides of it. And when we look at absolutism, there's really 4 major states that we call absolutist states. You know, there's a bunch of them, but the big 4 are France on one side and then Austria, Prussia, and Russia on the other. And the style of absolutism that is developed is a little bit different. Now, when Louis was doing his, remember this is a kind of a maritime state, Western European, at least to some degree before he started screwing with it, it was a middle class. That he could utilize that middle class as a way of kind of eliminating the power of the nobility because all of his administrative posts could be filled with middle class people. All right, people that would be directly loyal to him, and that breaks some of the stranglehold that the old nobility had in their various regions. But they're not going to have that ability to do that in Austria or Prussia or some of those other states. There isn't a middle class for them to do that. So the deal is for them, if they're going to be able to centralize authority, they've got to make a deal with the nobility. And this is going to have some pretty big effects. All right. One of them is what we call second serfdom, which means that in order for the nobles to be able to give up some of their local power to the monarch, they're going to have consolidating control over their peasants. meaning that it's virtually slavery. They remove their freedom of movement. They can buy and sell them in some places, like Russia, for instance. Their labor obligations are completely on somebody else's dime. So their freedom of movement is gone. This happened at a time, right around the time of the Black Plague. Remember, when we talked about the plague, we talked about it in like England and France and some of those places. Supposedly, because there was a diminished labor supply, the peasants were able to get more of a command position. They could ask for higher wages, or they could get some other kind of compromise, right? That didn't happen in the other place. And the reason why is because of the way that the social composition existed. You had a king who was weak. Remember, these are decentralized states in Central and Eastern Europe. You watch burgeoning centralized states in Western Europe. So you had a king that was utilizing a growing middle class to reduce the power of the nobility, and then you didn't have to worry about whether the nobles were going to take advantage of the peasants, because the king was working to try to create more uniformity in laws and starting to administer in a more centralized way. Central and Eastern Europe, that didn't happen. Okay, the nobles had an inordinate amount of power. There was no middle class to speak of, which means the nobles could screw the peasants without really any interference. And if the nobles were then going to consolidate bring their lands together to form some larger centralized state, we're going to yield to the Habsburg authority, or we're going to yield to the Hohenzollerns, or whoever it happens to be, there's going to have to be a deal that's cut. Okay? One of them is that all of the high administrative posts, whether they're the military officerships, if you're going to create a permanent standing army, it's going to be comprised entirely of the nobility. But the other is that there is a complete subordination of the peasantry that was already in place that those monarchs couldn't mess with. Okay? And it's going to take a long time for that to get resolved. Right? Ironically, the last of the European states to kind of when we say emancipate the serfs, but allow them to have freedom, was Russia. And they were able to pull it at, I think it was 1861. So they got it in 2 years before the United States got theirs in. All right? But anyway, you'll read about it. If there's a question of the differences between Eastern and Western absolutism, it's that the nobles were going to have a lot more command position to work with the monarch. And part of the expense of that was that the nobles had complete domination over the peasantry in their areas, because there really wasn't a middle class that the monarchy could rely on. I hope that is adequate as an explanation. Let's move to the notes that say Chapter 15 notes Austria and Prussia. All right. This is what comes out of the 30 Years' War, and it's logical. Remember when I told you, why does it make sense that absolutism would appear, when it did? It's because the 30 Years' War was so destructive, so devastating, that small decentralized states, where you could be the Duke of, what did I say, East Württemberg or whatever the thing was, that you being the head honcho in East Württemberg is terrific, but you're going to get ravaged by larger armies that are going back and forth across your lands. Why not surrender some of your political authority to some larger state that is going to consolidate its power? It's almost like, the mom and pop shop, right? Where they're like, hey, you're going to go out of business because we're much bigger and much stronger than you. Why don't you just join us? Okay? And we'll buy up your property. Well, it's kind of the deal that happens here. So out of that mass, the Holy Roman Empire, you guys remember my map? I'll let Josh draw it again later. But for the sake of time, the Holy Roman Empire, okay? Down here is Austria, okay? Up here is a little piece called Brandenburg. And then there's another piece over here called Prussia. And then there's some other stuff in here.
I want to take a picture of that.
All right. Well, here's the deal. This whole thing, remember, was 360 plus states. Okay? Archbishoprics, bishoprics, free cities, a whole bunch of other stuff. And there were some bigger states in there. There was a Bavaria, there's a Saxony, there's a place called Silesia, there's the Palatinate. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But Austria, which is the point of origin for the Habsburgs, after the 30 Years' War, and then this duchy called Brandenburg, where the Brandenburg was a host of one of the 7 German electors, and the ruling family there is called the Hohenzollerns. Out of this mass of craziness, you are going to see 2 super-states kind of emerge. Okay? One in the south, Austria, one in the north, Prussia. And the deal is what I told you it is. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. And there's some specifics to Austria's. All right, and I told you before that Viol chapter 9 is really good on this. It kind of breaks down most of the stuff that's in here. Okay, the beginnings of the Austrian Empire starts with this group called the hereditary possessions. This is what the Habsburg family had direct control over, which was Austria, where Vienna is. It's always going to be the capital. Then Styria and Tyrol. Those were the first 3. Then the first acquisition to a centralized Austrian empire, because they might have a title Holy Roman Empire or Emperor, and that existed until Napoleon, but nobody really gave it any credence after the 30 Years' War. So now they turn inward and they're consolidating around what they have direct political control of. So it starts with the hereditary possessions. Then remember, the first phase of the 30 Years' War added another big piece. What was that? It's this thing called the Crown of St. Wenceslaus, which is the Kingdom of Bohemia. Remember Bohemia? Remember us talking about that? Remember the defenestration of Prague where they chuck a couple of dudes out a window? Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the war that followed the defenestration of Prague, the Austrian Habsburgs and their Catholic allies literally rinsed the place of Protestants and consolidated control over Bohemia. And they would have control over Bohemia until the end of World War I, when they created Czechoslovakia. Okay? So it says the duchies, this is the other part, the duchies of Moravia and Silesia. They do have a couple of pieces that go along with it. All right? The third one was an outgrowth of this thing they call the Siege of Vienna. Okay, and I want to show you a site before I leave because it's just like a quick little snippet article. But there was a big thing that happened in 1683, and that was the last attempt by the Ottoman Empire to take Central Europe. And Vienna was the gate that they had to break through. If they got Vienna, they might have continued to go through the course of Central Europe. This is the last hurrah, like Justin Verlander if he was a 40-year-old pitcher, making one more attempt at a no-hitter or something like that. The Turks get there. They lay siege to Vienna, but between this guy named Prince Eugene of Savoy and a Polish king by the name of Jan Sobieski, here are the names down here, they were able to bring reinforcements because the Polish were also concerned about the Turks and the threat that they posed. And so they allied together. And in 1683, they were able to stop the onslaught at Vienna, and then they started to push the Turks back. So not only did they protect Vienna, but then they went after what is the present-day Hungary. Okay? They call that the Crown of St. Stephen. And there's a treaty that is signed called Karlowitz in 1699, where Austria acquires the Crown of St. Stephen. All right? This is going to be a rocky relationship. Just like Bohemia. Bohemia, since the days of Jan Hus, do not want to be controlled by Austria. They've been fighting vehemently for independence. And that will flare up here and there. Okay? The Hungarians, though, right away did not want to be part of the Austrian Empire. And so there's going to be periodic uprisings there as well. The Hungarians were under Turkish control, but the Turks weren't really involved in their business. You know, Hungarians, I think for the most part, they were like Lutheran, all right? Even though they were paying tribute to the Sultan, they were kind of independent. The Austrians seemed to be more in their business, centralized authority, Catholicizing their kingdom and that sort of thing. And so there was an uprising. While the Austrians were like wonder twinning with the English, trying to defeat Louis XIV in the War of Spanish Succession, there was an uprising among the Hungarian nobles called the Rákóczi Rebellion. Okay, you can keep that in mind. This is the problem with, it's going to plague them forever. All right, the problem with the Austrians is that there were so many different ethnic groups and subject nationalities that made up this thing called the Austrian Empire, that it was just a matter of time before they were going to start actively trying to break away. The Hungarians were really first. Maybe the Bohemians were first. But as they got bigger, they would acquire more subject nationalities, like the territories that they would acquire in Italy. All right, and that was the result of the War of Spanish Succession. What was the treaty that ended the War of Spanish Succession? Starts with a U. Utrecht. That's right. So Naples, Sardinia, Milan are all under Austrian control, which is a blessing and a curse. I'll talk about that later. All right, let me show you the map, because I'm going to go to both of these maps, but there's a section of your notes called maps. And you can at least take a look at the Austrian Empire as it builds. Okay? Yeah, that one works. Okay? So you can kind of see what it looks like. All right? Relative to the Ottoman Empire, this is all this crap that you see up here, that's all still Holy Roman Empire broken into a whole bunch of different pieces. But this is all consolidated. And it says 1657, this is the core. It's Tyrol, Austria, Styria. Then they convinced Carniola and Carinthia. It was one of those things like, hey, you want to be Carinthia? Go right ahead. You want to go it alone? Guess what? Hey, Walter. You want to go it alone, you're going to face the invading armies. Oh, by the way, big badass Turks. They could probably threaten you too. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to consolidate together. We're going to build a permanent standing army. We're going to drill them. We're going to train them. We're going to uniform them. And we're never going to have a 30 Years' War ever happen again to us. You want to join? And Carinthia and Carniola said, yeah, it sounds like a plan. We'll do that. Okay. As far as Moravia, Bohemia, Silesia, that's all stuff they gained during the first phase and a half of the 30 Years' War. Then, told you, Siege of Vienna, 1683. They withstand the onslaught from the Ottoman Empire. This was all Ottoman territory up to 1683. After they defeated them at Vienna, then they chased the Ottoman Empire deeper towards what we call the Balkans. Okay, so these regions here, and you can see some of the battles. Okay, there's one called Mohacs. It's in 1687. There's one called Karlowitz. There's one called Pasarowitz, I believe. Belgrade, which is in Yugoslavia. Is that right?
Serbia.
Yeah, used to be Yugoslavia. But so all of that territory down to about 1714 is under their control. Okay, and that's the Crown of St. Stephen stuff that we were talking about. Okay, and then after 1713, then they added Milan, then they added Naples, then eventually they would add Sardinia. Okay, so that's a pretty intact map. Here's the fun with Prussia. Let me get to that. I'm going to open up their map here too. What's a good one? That one's pretty good. There we go. All right. Everybody see the stuff in purple?
Yeah,
Which shade of purple?
All right. It's not great yet. They're working on it. Okay, but this territory here, where is
Everything is everywhere, and I don't know what the
No, I get you. There's a lot of that. But this territory here is where the beginning of Prussia kind of comes. All right, you have East Prussia over here. You got Pomerania. You got a few little like Cleves and Mark and a handful of. But the purple stuff is what ultimately is going to start getting consolidated into one state. And you can see that that's pretty good. But that's the process of about maybe 60 years to put all that together. And it starts out with bargains more than anything else. Those were the states that were probably the most vulnerable right after the 30 Years' War. Okay. What just happened? Oh, there we go.
You can't reproduce that score.
Yeah, this last year was
Okay.
good.
Here's the other fun about Prussia is that everybody is named Frederick William or Frederick William.
That's good.
Okay.
Wait.
Brandenburg is the beginning of it. It was called the sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire, apparently because nothing grew there. The Hohenzollerns was the family that had this political power in Brandenburg. They were electors. Remember that Hohenzollern himself had become a kind of key figure during the 30 Years' War and was one of the leading military people on the Protestant side. After the war is over, circa like 1645, 6, 7, at the very end, Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, who rules for almost 50 years here, is the one that really starts to get it together. All right, state bureaucracy, permanent form of taxation, a standing army. Remember, I told you what the trade-off is. The nobility in this region are called Junkers, spelled with a J. All right. Part of it was that this is another place where there was at least some element of religious tolerance. Protestants in particular that were fleeing what was happening in France made their way into Brandenburg. Okay, so while Louis is in charge, this is a state that's just kind of on its own, building itself into something. Okay, the person that eventually takes them to the next level was not a great leader. All right, he was known as Elector Frederick III the Ostentatious, which means he found out about Louis and Versailles and said, "Hey, that's cool. I want palaces, and I want to wear robes, and I want to have balls, like the dancing things." So fox hunts, whatever. So he spent a lot of money to try to live like Louis. He did one thing right, and that was during the War of Spanish Succession. This area that they had kind of consolidated in that previous 50 years, and they had built at least some modicum of a standing army. They decided to ally with Austria and the Netherlands and England against France. And what that did for them is that put them at a table where they got to be at Utrecht and got to be recognized as one of the victorious sides. Okay? So nobody really took them seriously. They didn't know who they were. All right, so Austria and England are kind of passing out the spoils of war. The Netherlands is recognized. And then it's like, who are you? And he's like, well, I'm Frederick. Like, where are you from, dude? And he's like, this place called Brandenburg, Prussia. It's like, Prussia? You mean Russia? No, Prussia. He's like, oh, come here, man. He's like, hey, you guys fought like dogs out there. We really appreciated everything you guys did. And they were like, you know what we're gonna do? Let's make this guy a king, and then they put him in like a headlock and gave him some noogies. Like, yeah, we're gonna call you King Frederick of Prussia. It's like, you mean Russia? No, he said Prussia. Prussia, King Frederick of Prussia. And so this is the first time that Prussia as a state is recognized as such, and that they have a monarch, okay, a Frederick. And then the next thing that happens is they build themselves into one badass army. Okay, the next guy that comes along is a little weird, but he's known as King Frederick William I, the Soldier King. Okay, and literally the nickname that Prussia acquires in this period is the Sparta of the North, because for him, the army was Versailles. Versailles is a symbol. Remember, it's a symbol of Louis's power. It's the way that he domesticated the nobility. He killed them with kindness. The way that Frederick William domesticates the younger nobility is to bring them into the army. They're required to serve in the army, and they've got to fight, basically, to earn whatever officerships they might have gotten. Okay? says the army doubles in size from 40,000 to 80,000, becomes the third largest standing army in Europe, even though they are 11th in population. Okay. Says he welcomed people of all faiths except Jews. He's German. All right. The other part of it, though, was that they called him the Soldier King. I mean, he was like the guy from Full Metal Jacket. I mean, he loved the army. He loved the uniforms. He loved the discipline. He loved, to line them up and kind of like, dress them down. Like, that button's out of place, and, and that kind of stuff. He liked the marches. He was like one of those guys, right? The other thing is that as into the military as he was, how many years did Frederick the William I fight?
Probably none.
0. Okay, in that 27-year period, the Sparta of the North never fought. And it was almost because his soldiers were so precious. It was like, one of those dudes that in a midlife crisis that buys like a 1967 Corvette convertible, and they have like a tarp that they put over the top of the vehicle, and it's in a special place in the garage. And then every once in a while, they'll wheel it out into the driveway, and then they'll polish it up a little bit. And then somebody's like, "Oh, cool, man, 67 Vet, let's drive it." He's like, "Oh, it can never be driven." It's like, well, don't touch it. Don't look at it. It's like, you've seen enough of it. And then he puts it back and wheels it back into the garage. Says, next time, next year, we'll buff him down again. He did that with soldiers. He's like, "Oh, I can't lose any of my soldiers. Look at them. They're perfect. Look how disciplined they are. They're tall, they're handsome." That was the weird part about it. It's like they said that he was like, I guess almost like a college recruiter. Not like Rick Pitino, but like a real college recruiter. He would go around into the countryside and he would be like, "Oh, look at that young man. He would make such a great soldier."
That's suspect.
Yeah, it was very, very sketch. Okay, but that's what they said. I mean, he was kind of like he was piecing together like this super unit. And he was like, "Oh, this man is going to be in the artillery," and puts him right there. And so that was it. And part of it is like, how genius. Because he didn't spend any money. He built this beautiful army, didn't blow it on a whole bunch of stupid wars. Frivolous, sorry. Can't use friv. Just debate talk, sorry. But that's it. And then the Junkers, remember how Louis kind of got off on having them fight over his dinner fork and stuff like that? This was his way of keeping them right in front of him and knowing who was going to be trouble. Everybody knew who was in charge, and they would kind of have to earn their space, and that's how he was able to kind of highlight who were the most loyal, who were the most skilled, that the army became that feature for him. Right, so everybody had their own style. Louis was a lover, Frederick wasn't really a fighter, but the army was certainly his way of doing what Louis was doing with Versailles. So that makes it kind of cool. And by 1740, this is the other story that's kind of cute, is that his son becomes the greatest Prussian king. They call him an enlightened absolutist, but his name is Frederick II. Known as Frederick the Great. And when he was a kid, he was has anyone ever seen a Wedding Crashers? You ever seen that that artsy kid that's kind of off in the corner doing all that?
Me.
All right, well, it's he's and his dad's Mr. Army, and he's an artsy kid, it just didn't work. He's "Son, how many push-ups you do today?" He's "I didn't do any push-ups." He's "Why didn't you do any push-ups?" "Because I hate you, and I hate your stupid army," and that kind of thing. And he would be just a rebel, right? And it was cute because his soldier dad never fought, and then Frederick II, when he becomes the king, is "Wow, I have this army," and then fights nonstop. So artsy, kind of rebel kid becomes a warrior, pretty much, fighting Austria pretty much nonstop for about 25 years. So anyway, that's all I got. That's it for tonight. 8:08. Oh man, thank you so much. Warms my heart. So I'll see you guys on Thursday. We'll do some Russia.